Komið sæl öll, verið velkomin. I will proceed in English as today's lecture will be in that language. So, hello everyone and welcome. And on behalf of RIKK, Institute for Gender Equality and Difference at the University of Iceland, I want to welcome you to the fourth lecture in the fall 2023 series on decolonization. Today's lecture is titled Trapped in Coloniality, Iceland and Its Others. My name is Gunnþórunn Guðmundsdóttir and I'm Professor of Comparative Literature here at the university, and I will be moderating today's session. We have three presenters today. Jón I Kjaran is Professor of Queer Pedagogy and Sociology of Education at the University of Iceland School of Education. Their research focus is on gender, sexuality, ethnicity, race, queer studies, queer issues, migration and violence. And Giti Chandra, she is currently research specialist with the Gender Equality Studies and Training Program at the University of Iceland, where she also teaches literature and cultural studies. Her research areas include trauma studies and sexual harassment, theories and narratives of violence, and constructions of collective identity. And Mohammad Naeimi is a lecturer and researcher in gender politics and education at the School of Education at the University of Iceland. And recently, his research focus is on queer activism in the Global South, diversity in academia, queer Muslims, and queer immigrants belonging formation. Now, the topic of their lecture is the television series Trapped, Ófærð. Its representation of Africa and the people coming from there, as well as Iceland and Icelandic people, with a focus on the intersection of ethnic background, gender, and sexuality. They will all three be presenting here today, so we will have a bit of back and forth between them, and then we will have time for discussion after that. Your floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all. As Gunnþórunn mentioned, then I will be presenting with my colleagues, Giti and Mohammad, on the title Trapped in Coloniality. We base our analysis on the two seasons of the Trapped series, which were quite popular, both outside and inside of Iceland. In our analysis, we use post-colonial discourse analysis, and we approach our topic from a decolonial perspective. The Trapped seasons highlight some issues with regards to Iceland and its other, as we will give example of in this lecture. For those who have not seen these two seasons, then briefly this. Both seasons take place in a small fishing village in Iceland. In season 1, murder investigation intersects with human trafficking of two Nigerian African girls. In season 2, the murder investigation intersects with the narrative of an African male worker who is in some kind of relationship with an Icelandic guy. So in both series, Africa, the narrative of Africa is quite dominant. So I will now give the floor to Giti, please, and she will talk about Iceland.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We've been through this. Okay. So what I wanted to talk about is the construction of Iceland. And so when I talk about it, I'm going to say we and us, and I include myself in it for various reasons. We can talk about those later. And so what I'm doing here to start out with is just to look at how the reception of this series happened pretty much around Europe. But I had, emails from India, Giti, have you seen this new serial and so on. So I want to say around the world, but let's stick with Europe and the US. And so I put these two photographs. That one is taken from the promotions for the series, the one on the right. This one is actually, Siglufjörður, sort of a more realistic, if you like, photograph. And the reason I put it is to remind us of the history maybe 75 years ago when the women of Siglufjörður were dating British soldiers. And the men got really annoyed, and I'm sure most of you know this story, but I found it fascinating. And they decided to boycott the women who were dating these soldiers. And the women, of course, responded by boycotting all Siglufjörður men, who then learned the error of their ways and stopped what they were doing. And I give this as an example of just what is real and familiar and what is presented as exotic. And so I want to focus on this tension between the familiar and the exotic, and how they both, reside in the same place. And I'll come to that a little more later. So here are some of the things that, little snippets that I took from various reviews of the series. And I've highlighted some of the text because I feel that it leads us to a certain kind of view of how the outside world saw this series and saw Iceland through it. And so I think it's interesting that, bleak and Icelandic go so well together. It's like this natural literary reviewing style, And then, the storm hitting the remote town, and it's this very typical kind of representation. The small fishing village, the breathtaking landscapes, the unique setting, the idea of justice being deeply rooted in its traditions, and then the Nordic noir genre that I want to talk about a little bit, which Gunnþórunn is an expert on. Looking at this kind of reception, what are the questions that we can take away from this, that arise from it? And so, whose Iceland is it? What exactly is this Iceland that is constructed? What kind of community, what kind of people does it represent? And because of the nature of the crimes that take place, a focus on gender. What is the kind of gender narrative that is produced on this community, which is seen as typically Icelandic? And as I want to focus on what is the us that is constructed, against which the them of Africa then, is so easy to create in this us and them. And then also, I'm going to start at the bottom. What is the target audience, and how does it affect the production of this series and this image of Iceland? So, I mean genre in a kind of literary cultural sense and marketing, and what do they have to do with each other? So, as we say, follow the money. Who was funding this? And therefore, who gets to, not decide, but have a large voice in the decision-making of what gets produced? So how are genre and marketing connected? And one of the big literary exports of Iceland itself is what is called the Nordic noir genre, the crime fiction. And so it is, of course, placed in a Nordic context. There is, of course, Stig Larsson, there's Jón I, there's a bunch of other people, and here in Iceland, of course, there's Arnaldur Indriðason, there's Yrsa, there is Ragnar Jónasson. So there's all of these really big international names. And so when the outside world is thinking of Iceland in terms of its literature or its cultural output, then other than the couple of musical bands and so on that are very popular, in literature, the crime fiction is its big export and has, I think, a larger sort of market even than the sagas, which are the most important thing. And so for marketers to tag the serial with Nordic noir is to put it actually into this very familiar space of what Iceland comes to mean for people outside Iceland. So the glacial pace, I thought, clearly the reviewer is stretching his knowledge of Iceland and says, oh, glacier, so slow pace, let's call it glacial. The believable situation, the regular folk, is part of what we call the police procedural. So it's not big action, crime thriller, Stig Larsson kind of thing. It is very much the police procedural, which has a social realism as its literary home space. It talks about just the regular day-to-day work of policemen. The crime is almost never some dramatic, huge, terrible, horrific thing. It's usually familiar, commonplace crime, domestic violence, jealousy, that kind of thing. And I'll come back to the crime bit also soon. So there's a list of international corporate partners and people who are executive producers. And so, in a way, the branding of Iceland through the Nordic noir brings us to what is called the paradox of that genre, which is that the Nordic countries are supposed to be so crime-free comparative with the rest of the world. And so this is something that's been talked about a good deal by people who think about Nordic noir, and it's called the Nordic paradox, that, all of this talk of crime and all of that, the whole genre of crime fiction, and yet, coming from a space that is so relatively crime-free. And this leads people, I think, who read Nordic noir to regard it with a degree of indulgence. It's a little bit like a Tom and Jerry cereal, where that no matter how hard you hit them and what happens, so they're never really going to die. And so we're free from that kind of anxiety, and we watch them, two animals trying to kill each other, with a certain amount of indulgence. Because, of course, nothing is. And so I think that the Nordic noir exists in this kind of literary space where the crime-free status of the Nordic countries kind of insulates us against the actual crime that we're reading. And I think that's interesting because I'm going to talk a little bit about how this is both familiar but also exotic. So here, the top, of course, the poster is from promotional material. The picture at the bottom is one that I've taken. And it's of, if you recognize it, it's of Akureyri. You can see from the church, if nothing else. And the reason I put these up is because this is exotic, but that is familiar. But they look actually very similar to each other. And that's the tension that I want to focus on, how the exotic can also be the familiar. And I indulged in a little bit of free-form survey doing when I was preparing for this. And I asked people what their notion of Iceland was. What to you represents, in essence, your Iceland? And I got a lot of answers, but most of them were similar to this. A mountain that I particularly like to climb, which gives me a view of the fjord, or the fishing village, or the small town where I grew up, or the farm that my grandparents had, and so on. Something very familiar, very comfortable, very community-based, something that focused on the community values that you have in small places, the safety of it, the feeling of shared values, the sort of homogeneous culture, and so on. And I think what's interesting is that this is exactly the familiar and the us that is projected as the exotic for the outside viewer. So I added this. Even the Danish think we're exotic because there is this whole, the Danish ship that comes in with the captain and so on, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I want to say that this is not something that's peculiar to Iceland. It's, I don't know how many other people face this, but when my parents, when my father retired, we moved out of Delhi, where I'd lived all my life, to the outskirts. And I went to visit my father, and I was in the house, and the doorbell rang, and I opened it, and there was a woman who looked like she had stepped out of the National Geographic on my doorstep. She had the, silver bangles and armlets. She had the big gypsy skirt. She had the hoops. And I was on vacation from my PhD in New Jersey. And I looked at her and I thought, hi, what do you want? She said, you have to move your car. And then the city girl kicks in. I'm like, I'm not moving my car. Why should I move my car? Why do you want me to move my car? And she said, you have to move your car. And I said, why do you want me to move my own car from my own driveway? And she pointed behind her. And there was a row of camels, I kid you not, a row of camels, all of which had these big bedsheet sacks on their backs. And inside the bedsheet sacks were alternately children and sheep. And I looked at her, and I looked at them, and I said, you know what, give me a minute, I'll just get my keys. I'm moving out. And so I think this, what I think is familiar suddenly becomes exotic to me because I'm seeing it through someone else's eyes. And I looked at this woman and I said she was familiar to me only from the National Geographic, from documentaries on India. It was nobody that I had seen in my life there. So I think some of this familiar and exotic is what is at work here that I want us to focus on. I'm just going to see if So I'm going to suggest that part of it is a result of this double audience that we have. And so while I was working on this, along with the marketing here and the funders being, many of them from outside Iceland, even though the series was first commissioned for RÚV, along with it is this idea of who is our audience. And we are writing for ourselves, but we're also writing for the outsider at the same time. And interestingly, I discovered that actually the story had been written and the screenplay by a British man who was called in to actually create the story out of it. So there was the bare bones of the plot, and then this man was called in, Clive Bradley. Clive Bradley is British. He wrote the entire series in English. It was translated into Icelandic for the show. And so the fact that I did not know this, I didn't suspect it, I think is interesting, how cleverly this is done. And as Jón was saying, it raises the question of who creates Iceland, who produces Iceland, and for whom. We're such a tourist-centered economy. How do we produce ourselves for the tourist? Are Icelandic people doing it? Are other people coming in and doing it? And so I think it's very complicated. And it's something that I would like to just raise for discussion. So one of the things that is central to the plot and central to my concerns also is this idea of the gender equality paradise. So we're all familiar with this idea that, yes, we're better than many, in fact, almost everyone else out there, but we're not perfect, and which is, that's a different conversation. But I wanted to focus on how the gender relationships in this small community are presented to us as largely healthy. The policeman, the policewoman are depicted by the plot as very much equal to each other. I had earlier the photo of Hinrika, the policewoman's husband, who is a little bit out there, but also their relationship is so comfortable. His relationship with the trafficked women is so comfortable. When I watched that scene, I thought, oh God, is he going to do something? Is he going to molest them? But he doesn't. And I wonder if that was my response, but would someone else watching it have had this response? So in general, the relationships, gendered relationships, are extremely sort of equal in the series itself. Sorry, here, this one. And what does this do to the actual crime? So if the actual crime that is there is one of domestic violence, is intimate partner violence, does tagging it as familiar defang it? Does it make it easier for us to accept and to acknowledge? Because the big, terrible crime of human trafficking is done by the Danish guy. And so does domestic violence then become okay in this gender paradise, familiar, as against the big, terrible crime that the Danish people are carrying out? And so just to finish, before I hand over to Jón and Mohammad again, what happens when we are them? What happens when we see ourselves through the eyes of other people as exotic? And so anyone who's actually interested in the area, you might recognize this painting. It was used by Edward Said as the cover of Orientalism, his sort of watershed book, in which he talks about the creation of the self and the other and the Orient, etc. And you can see here the way in which we as a viewer are looking at it from here, and we can see both the desiring gaze and the object of its desire. And I wanted to talk about desire as I lead into Mohammad and Jón's part of this, to think about desire as something that is always exotic. So if you define desire as something that wants the unattainable, and you think of the exotic as something that desires always the unattainable, something that's never familiar, and then you think about how this familiar community is created as something that we all want, we all remember from our childhoods. I don't remember it from mine, but I'm going to say we. From our childhoods as Icelandic people, which is something maybe that's going further and further away, but something that we still desire. And I thought that this question of desire really complicates this entire issue of what is exotic, what is familiar, what is unattainable, what is it that we want, and the desiring gaze that creates this other from here. Jón, have I entirely run out of time? All right, we can come back to all of these questions, and I'm going to hand over to Jón, who will then take us into part 2.
So as Giti was talking about in connection to the exotic and desire, then I would like to talk a little bit about Africa, because sometimes Africa is often depicted as something which is exotic. And for example, I'm now reading this book by Dipo Faloyin, Africa is Not a Country. And when I was going through the series, the episodes, this quote from Mbembe came often into my mind. So this is a quote from Mbembe's book on post-colony, which was published in 2001. So here he is drawing attention to how the West, the global North, presents Africa as the other, or even other in order to constitute its own self-image or identity as developed and modern. Africa, on the other hand, is depicted as dystopic place, ravaged by wars and poverty. In other words, the image of Africa presented in the West, media, TVs, films, has reproduced the discourse of the Dark Continent, which has, since Joseph Conrad published his novella The Heart of Darkness, been associated with the continent of Africa. This was also used by the colonial powers as an argument for their colonial policies, projects, and their task of bringing the light to the continent and saving its population. Thus, the narrative of the white savior and the white man's burden was established within the African context and is now evident in the public discourse in the global North, which presents Africa and its people in need of saving, particularly from themselves. We have many examples of white saviorism in the public discourse, from celebrities like Madonna and Angelina Jolie adopting African children to the famous Live Aid concerts in 1984. So the topic here is a little bit about the white savior, and we see that very often, particularly in season 2, which we will a little bit focus on in this second part of our lecture. So a little bit about our theories and concepts, although we don't want to drown you in theories and concepts, and more going into the stuff that we were analyzing. So we are just in this part going to introduce some toolbox of theories which has helped us to analyze the data from our colonial queer perspective. And the aim is to not to give a full account of these theories and concepts, but mainly to introduce them to you and share our thoughts on them. So firstly, there is the concept of homo nationalism and then nationalism, which we use to analyze some of the data. Homo nationalism, as defined by Puar, we have here on the slide, is to establish this discourse within the global North that some members of the queer community are included, whereas others are excluded. So homo nationalism is also about creating the image of ourselves here in the West as being more inclusive with regards to gender diversity or sexuality diversity. So it harmonizes well with the concept of nationalism. So we use these concepts sometimes together in our analysis, nationalism and homo-nationalism. And Mohammad will come more to these concepts when he discusses the concept of cosmopolitanism. Yes. Othering has briefly been discussed by Giti, so I will not dwell on that. But we have here the definitions, which I just took a simple definition from the Cambridge Polity Press. Can be defined as a process of demarcation, by which line is drawn between us and them. So, as Giti was mentioning, seeing them in us and vice versa. And then there's the concept of the white savior, which is quite, in my view, quite obvious in the second season of Trapped. And I have put here on the slide some points regarding the white savior and what is sometimes called the white savior syndrome. So the white savior syndrome then represents the continuation of colonialism through the discourse by practicing the civilizing of the global South according to the standards of the North. And Frantz Fanon, for example, has mentioned this in his book. The black soul is the white man's artifact, the creation of blackness in the white imagination. So I will come back to the white saviorism later on when I give some examples from season 2. But I now give the floor to Mohammad, who will discuss 2 or 3 more concepts.
More concepts.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. So in the second part, we have several concepts and theories based on what Giti and Jón gave us, on the plot of the series. Now we know that the Trap series represent Iceland, not only at the level of national boundaries, but also in connection with different cultures at the level of global communities. This is why we have the concept of imaging communities and cosmopolitanisms. Because Iceland is a national state showing a dynamic interplay between nationalism or national boundaries and transnational and global communities. Iceland embodies elements of both a cosmopolitan society with global and diverse influences and an imaging community with a strong sense of shared national identity. Iceland, like any other nation state, is an imaging community because wherein members across time and space do not directly know each other, but perceive and imagine that they are a part of a broader group sharing national values, including language, history, culture, to make their own nation and reinforce the sense of belonging. At the same time, Iceland shows cosmopolitan characteristics that go beyond national boundaries. It is exemplified by its active participation in international organizations, tourism industry, and diplomatic relationship. Iceland has experienced a steady influx of immigrants over the years, contributing to a multicultural community. Iceland is also known for its strong commitment to gender equality and LGBTQ rights. These values position Iceland as a beacon of progressivism in international contexts. But the concept of cosmopolitanism, from some sociologists' perspective, is a desirable tendency to a global world, openness to foreign cultures, and as a potential solution to political, economic, and ecological problems at the global level. But on the other hand, other researchers criticize such tendency that overlook the working of capital, both cultural and social, that produces and perpetuates stratification at the global level. In a global expansion, neoliberal political economic climate, which is characterized by hierarchies of power and hierarchies, and power imbalances, capitals play a role in shaping one's habits, embody the skills and capabilities, reflecting the social position of individual within global field of competition for dominant position. To develop competencies, a cosmopolitan subject therefore needs to be strategic, taking certain bodies of knowledge, particular sociocultural norm, specific form of consumptions, everyday life practices, and certain level of education. On this account, in a nation state where its values are grounded on nationalism and cosmopolitanism is tied to competencies and power imbalances, a sense of exceptionalism appears that can be envisioned with regard to dichotomy of self and other, or us and them. Such entanglement of exceptionalism within cosmopolitanism is a paradox. While cosmopolitanism is about appreciation of diverse cultures, exceptionalism is grounded on the narrative of superiority. The reason behind this paradox are first, Eurocentric or Weberian understanding of modernity, then modernity developed only in the West and then spread to other cultures to gain universal significance. Therefore, non-Western discourses, for example, discourses of identity and subject formation, should be fundamentally distinct from the modern discourses. This distinction is envisioned as a center-periphery relation, with modern at the center and traditional on the periphery. The second reason is a nonlinear historical progression and at the same time regression in the working of power dynamicity, and that may produce discursive ruptures. Nordic region has often been associated with exceptionalism, since they are mostly depicted as more democratic, modern, progressive, non-discriminatory, and free of racism than the rest of the world. Exceptionalism of Iceland, apart from welfare state, which is often equated with commitment to equality, women's rights, LGBTQ protection, and inherent kindness in a broad sense, has also been associated with the perception of historical innocence that is strong in Iceland, where its entanglement in racism has been characterized by effort to prove its innocence. In many ways, since the nation was formerly ruled by Danish government and didn't directly take part in colonial project. The image of Iceland as a Nordic exception is tightly associated with Icelandicness as white. This subject formation is strongly normalized as white identity, with the Icelandic body that always assumed as white. Sarah Ahmad sees whiteness as an ongoing and unfinished history, which orientates body in specific directions, affecting how they take spaces and what they can do. Therefore, whiteness is institutionalized through institutional habits and bodily orientation and proximity of certain objectives that provide a feeling of familiarity and belonging for certain bodies while produce strangeness and exclusion for others. In Iceland context, therefore, the prevailing norm is the identification with a white ethnicity, where the Nordic body is inherently associated with the concept of whiteness. Consequently, bodies that do not conform to this norm are often perceived as others. Iceland's Nordic exceptionalism is also reflected in the realm of gender and sexuality, as it has long been framed within utopian imaginary in terms of gender equality and LGBTQ rights. The ILGA, the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association, reports and maps are the examples that reinforce such exceptionalism. As Iceland has been ranked as one of the top 10 countries, among others, in terms of enactment of legal and civil rights of LGBT protection, without giving intersectional perspective for the queers and queers of colors, immigrant, refugee, and those who are affiliated within religious background in queer communities. Ellenberg argues that in recent years, the image of Iceland has become associated with a gay utopia or safe space. This image, according to her, is built on the ground of racism and anti-multiculturalism that together work as technology of othering to exclude those who belong to other racial, ethnic, and religious backgrounds. For example, talking about Icelandic exceptionalism and racialization of LGBTQ issues, Gudmundsdóttir and Skaptusdóttir have shown how queer migrants in the process of creating sense of belonging to Iceland queer community and wider Icelandic society potentially face multiple discrimination. For example, regarding the politics of belonging, being non-white or a foreigner, or in connection to language fluency, and relating to performance of correct queerness. Finally, the issues and relationship of cosmopolitanism, exceptionalism, and emerging community all obscure multiple hierarchies and exclusion and limit our understanding of lived experience of marginalized community. In this context, social welfare, gender equality, and gay-friendly space obscure the working of exclusionary mechanisms that appear in the form of racism in LGBTQ communities or in the form of structural racism and violence that marginalize immigrants.
So now just briefly giving some examples, because we are running out of time, but we will have some discussion later on. So here I want to try to connect more like theory to what we were analyzing. So here we have example of nationalism or homo-nationalism, and this is one of the main characters in this series is Hanna Stina, who is a chairperson of Hamar Thors, or the Hammer of Thor. And this examples, like the quote here in Icelandic, which is from the series, and what Hanna Stina is saying, and also then the picture of the car, which has the graffiti of Muslimasleikja, which may be difficult to translate into English, would be some kind of Muslim. Demonstrate the Islamic phobia also, that is also very apparent in this part, in this season. And the argument here made by the member of Hamar Thor is the importance of the Icelandic language, and this notion that the Muslims are somehow taking over in terms of the economy, in terms of building this factory in this small town. So here then we have the representation of Africa in need of being rescued. We have this relationship between this white Icelandic guy. His name has this very Nordic Icelandic name. His name is Víkingur, or the Viking. And he is in a relationship with a very typical Ghanaian African name, Ebo. And Ebo and Víkingur are together. They are lovers. And it's very interesting how also the series tries to draw this, this exotic, like Víkingur is also exotized in this series. He's like white, he's strong, he's like this notion of the Icelandic hero, like he could be like Gunnar and Hlíðarendi or something like that. And then we have Ebo, who is like, should be the representing of Africa, and they are very much in love. And Ghana is, in this episode, depicted as being a place where you can absolutely not be gay. And it is depicted as dystopic in terms of sexuality and gender diversity. And Víkingur is trying to save Ebo. And he's always saying to Ebo, why don't you stay in Iceland? Iceland is a safe place for you. Here you can stay. And that speaks to what Mohammad was talking about this queer exceptionalism which Iceland has been connected to. But in the series, Eppo is never asked what he is. We never see what, is he gay? We never get any information about that. Eppo has 2 kids and a wife back in Ghana, and maybe the relationship between Eppo and Víkingur was just, you know, contextual to that particular period, not necessarily his identity as a gay person. And this is something that the season is never discussing. They somehow always assume that Eppo is gay because he is in a relationship with Víkingur. But we can come more later to that. And then finally about the queer migrant, which as I mentioned, it is assumed that Eppo is gay and that he wants to move to Iceland and stay in Iceland. And it is somewhat depicted that Eppo has no future outside of Iceland. And this is, for example, expressed in conversation Víkingur has with his mother at the end of the season, when his mother is asking Víkingur, what happened to Eppo? Where is Eppo? And Víkingur says, well, he went back. And then the mother says, well, will he be saved there? And Víkingur replies, no. So drawing a little bit on Fanon, the queer migrant serves as an inverted other that confirms the subjectivity of the queers of the white and the global north. However, at the same time, countries in the global north are tightening their laws and regulations regarding migration, asylum, and refugee seekers, which is not discussed in the series at all. Thus, on the one hand, global north wants to be seen as queer utopia, open to everybody fleeing persecution based on its queerness. That is the picture painted in season 2, which then contributes to the homo-nationalist discourse and construct the subjectivity of the white queer citizens of the global north. On the other hand, migration regimes limit those who can move freely on the basis of queerness and put in place strict rules and regulations regarding the process of gaining refugee, asylum. And this is not discussed in season 2. So, of course, we can talk about other themes that we analyze, and we will, of course, extend more on these when we write the paper. But finally, we just want to emphasize that Trapped gives us a very interesting lens to analyze not only Icelandic society, but also how Iceland is seen, as Giti mentioned, by others, and also how we in Iceland see others. For example, how we see Africa. Thank you very much.